Welcome to today's webinar entitled Effective eDiscovery Doesn't Have to Break the Budget. My name is Amy Baker and I'm here with Sherpas Software Marketing. I have the pleasure of being your MC this afternoon and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I know that you have many webinars to choose from these days, so we really appreciate that you chose our session. But before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping details. Everyone will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing your questions in the questions panel of the control panel. And you may send your questions in at any time that you think about them. You don't need to hold them to the end. We're going to collect them and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and a replay of the webinar will be emailed to you and the slides will be made available on the sherpasoftware.com website. So with all of those details taken care of, I'm going to introduce you to today's speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Rick Wilson. He's the VP of Strategy and Solutions for Sherpas Software. He has over a dozen years of experience in information governance, is a certified AIM information governance practitioner, and ARMA info specialist, and he regularly speaks on the topic of information governance and eDiscovery at industry events. Also joining us is Marta Farnsbach. Marta is the Director of Product Services, overseeing the development and growth of Sherpa's on-premises and eDiscovery products and is responsible for ensuring customer satisfaction. Since joining Sherpa in 2003, she's been deeply ingrained in eDiscovery best practices and processes while expanding her expertise in litigation preparedness, compliance, and content management. So with that, I'll hand the presentation over to Rick. Rick, the virtual floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. This is Rick Wilson. Thank you for that introduction, Amy. And I'm so pleased to be with you on today's webinar to talk about this topic of eDiscovery. It's one that's really near and dear to our hearts because it makes up a significant portion of our business. So let me start just briefly by giving you a little background on Sherpas Software. If you aren't familiar with us, we're just about to approach our 20th anniversary in September of this year. So Sherpa started as a startup organization back in the year 2000 with a single software product. Today, we offer a whole variety of tools to allow our customers to manage electronic information. And we do that in a variety of ways. Some of those tools are targeted towards information governance. A number of them are targeted towards our topic today, eDiscovery. And we also have tools that allow customers to manage information in other ways. So you may notice at the bottom of the slide, we work with a number of organizations, some of which you may know. They're very well-known names. Some of them are a little bit smaller or perhaps regional. One of the interesting things about what we do is the fact that every organization, regardless of size, has electronic information that they need to manage in some fashion. So that really makes our portfolio of clients very wide and very broad. So one of the things that I wanted to mention before we get started with regards to a little history lesson on eDiscovery is back in the year 2006, the federal rules of civil procedure were modified in the US to really force companies to track electronic information a little bit more procedurally than they had prior to that. And that was really the genesis of this whole eDiscovery space. But I'm going to introduce at this point Marta Farnsbach, who's my colleague here at Sherpas Software. And some of you who are customers on this webinar may be familiar with Marta. I've worked with her in the past. She's really been the guiding force behind our Discovery Attender for Windows software, and she's helped many of our customers effectively use that tool to complete their search projects. Thanks for being with us today, Marta, and generously offering to share your expertise. I know you have a lot to say on this topic, so let's get started. Could you begin by helping us understand exactly what eDiscovery projects entail and why they're in such high priority?
Sure, Rick. Thank you very much for that really kind introduction and welcome everyone to the webinar. I'm going to say hello. So eDiscovery, what is electronic discovery? I think the best way to start is to talk a little bit about the basics of eDiscovery, and then we'll talk about why it's important to your organizations. So technically, eDiscovery is the act of preserving, identifying, collecting, reviewing, and producing electronically stored information known as ESI, in response to a request for production. Now, these requests can come from a variety of sources, but is most often most critical, I should say, stem from legal proceedings. Please keep in mind, though, eDiscovery demands also originate from other departments, including compliance, security, HR, and they can even be triggered from outside your organization. Now, this is particularly true if you're subject to something like an open records law or other regulations such as HIPAA for healthcare or GDPR or CCPA for privacy protection. So eDiscovery is basically a request to produce records that are under the purview of your business. This data can be stored in a number of locations. Some of them are not so obvious, and others are. Email servers, file shares, but they can also be hidden in corporate systems, think ShareForce or PeopleSoft, social media accounts, or even legacy systems. And don't forget about places like backup tapes, mobile data, laptops. Now, email is the most commonly requested type of data, but all this data can be subject to eDiscovery requirements. And collecting that data can be very, very disruptive to business processes. Knowing where this data resides, and some might say hides, and knowing how to access it is essential because an organization is responsible, in other words, liable, for all that data stored in their systems. Furthermore, in many jurisdictions, including in the United States, the responding party in a litigation has a duty to do so. In other words, you're legally required to find all reasonably accessible data relevant to the matter at hand. And this duty arises when an organization has an inkling that it will become involved in litigation, not just when it's officially sued or subpoenaed. Now, lastly, the steps to producing this information must follow some very strict rules. Failure to do so can result in some pretty severe penalties, or it can end up costing you a considerable amount of time, money, stress, or sanctions. Now, this is especially true when dealing with legal or regulatory requests.
Wow, I think we're starting to get the picture, Marta. Clearly ignoring these requests is not an option. So can you share some tips with our listeners about how to handle their eDiscovery process more efficiently?
Absolutely. And just to be clear, an efficient eDiscovery strategy can be put together regardless of budget. The goal is to streamline the discovery process while minimizing the business disruption, reducing the risks, while making it easier to store and find exactly what is required and not an iota more. Now, to make this process more effective, the eDiscovery should be proactive, it should be defensible, and it should be collaborative. Without each of these parts, the whole might not succeed, and it will certainly ending up costing a lot more than it ought. So let's start with talking about proactive process in eDiscovery. This is the biggest step, but it's also the most worthwhile. With all the pieces in place, eDiscovery can become just like any other business process. It shouldn't be as disruptive, it shouldn't be difficult, it shouldn't be stressful. The more litigious or regulated a company is, of course, the more important it becomes to establish and document the overall policy, especially rules for retention and defensible deletion. Another crucial step is to build a team with key stakeholders who can collaborate on strategies for preservation, for litigation hold, and collection. And then to avoid last-minute scrambles, data maps and system inventories need to be kept, and they need to be kept updated. Last but not least, the right resources, software, vendors, and personnel should already be identified and functional before you even get into litigation. So that one of the key steps of being proactive is information governance. And just for the record, being proactive is not only an essential step in good eDiscovery practice, it becomes even more important when you're working with limited funds. The main expense of eDiscovery is in the review of documents. This expense is directly related to the volume of data produced on your corporate systems and handing it over to inside or outside counsel. Ideally, the policy and the process should be in place that limits organizational data to either that to which is relevant to your organization and your business needs, or which is required by information or regulation. Good information governance policies will do this for you. They will reduce the amount of data to that which is relevant. Now, information governance is a huge topic in and of itself. Rick and I have both done webinars on it, but there are several areas that should be targeted with an eye towards eDiscovery, specifically data maps and retention policies. Now, you would think that keeping updated data maps would be a key consideration for all IT departments. However, experience tells us that this falls by the wayside, and it's not always the case. Good data maps not only need to be created and kept updated, but they should identify, among other things, where your data is located, who owns the data, what kind of data stores are challenging to access, where is that data backed up, and what tools do you have in-house that can be used to access and search that data. Okay, once you know where that data is, it really does help every other step in the discovery process. Now, another key element of information governance that directly leads to good eDiscovery policy is having defined retention policies and processes that you need to enforce them. These policies should clarify the time limits for keeping various types of data, because without that policy in place, you have very little argument for defensible deletion. In fact, it can be argued that all data must be stored, including items that are redundant, outdated, and trivial, which we also refer to as rot. Aside from the fact that this kind of clutter impacts business needs, this data can be costly to store, costly to search, and worse, in many cases, the company is liable for every little bit of it. So if you don't have a plan in place to remove this data and documented how this data is removed, then you might well be liable for it. So just remember, absent a retention policy, the company has a legal duty to produce anything that might be relevant in litigation or GDPR requests, CCPA, etc. Now, just think for a moment how much rot lives in legacy data or backups or archives, and it gets kind of scary. Now, aside from information governance, there are plenty of places to be proactive. You should know how you will handle your you should know how you will handle an eDiscovery request before it even becomes a glimmer on the horizon. To help with this, you want to create an eDiscovery team and implement an eDiscovery process ahead of time. Now, the formation of an efficient team is essential for any eDiscovery process to work effectively. Members should be empowered to create and implement policy. To that end, the team should be pulled from stakeholders from legal, IT, and other business units, but also be able to consult with other departments like compliance or records management. They will support overall efforts and be a good asset to the team when you actually need to deploy it. Now, in addition to the proactive planning for this eDiscovery, the eDiscovery team is ideally suited to bring together boilerplate processes for other tasks like dealing with GDPR, CCPA, open records requests. Okay, so the team is helpful not just for eDiscovery, but for all kinds of other processes. Now, let's talk specifically about the eDiscovery process, because the experience that you're going to have with the team will help you identify triggers for discovery and the personnel who need to be involved in any pending matter. They should also identify the tools that can be used to accomplish a defensible collection and point out any challenging areas that may prevent the efficient collection from taking place. These proactive measures are not only an essential step in good eDiscovery practice, they're especially important if you're working with limited funds. Having policy in place will limit the amount of data that needs to be collected, which directly impacts the cost of reviewing and processing. Being able to easily deploy tools and identify people of interest and data stores that will make maximum use of your resources will help you use them rather than waste them in the scramble through complex data systems under a deadline. Identifying the problem areas in advance gives your attorneys a good background for legally required discussions that they have to have with opposing counsel. You don't want to go into those meetings not knowing data stores that can't be accessed or what kinds of personnel are being used. Lastly, having a tested, repeatable process in place and knowing which tools to use will significantly improve the turnaround time and reduce mistakes. So as you can see, being proactive can save a considerable amount of time, especially when the requests come rolling in. However, even if your organization has not taken the steps to be proactive, let's just say a request comes in, you don't have anything in place, you should still be able to mitigate risk and also save money by making sure your eDiscovery requests are handled in a defensible manner. Many eDiscovery requests are performed on a tight budget, and these suffer because no attention is paid to the defensibility of request. Defensibility is the ability to justify the processes and policy for your entire eDiscovery process and then defend it when it comes under scrutiny. Think in depositions or testimony in court cases. Mistakes in this area are especially damaging when dealing with requests from security or legal teams. Effective defensible policy is marked by very specific needs. Data should be preserved in as close to native format as possible. The entire process should be adequately audited, and you should ensure that repeating the steps in your process will have consistent results. So let's go through each of those. Preservation is making sure that the data is relevant to the matter at hand and it is not altered or deleted. Altered data, even unintentionally, is known as spoliation. It carries severe judicial penalties and can call your entire eDiscovery process into question. Equally hazardous is the fact that you cannot search or collect data that is not there. Deletion and wiping activities are often scrutinized by the courts in an adverse manner, which could negatively impact your case, leading to fines or even dismissal of the suit. The proactive steps we discussed earlier can help in a good retention policy. Will outline how automated and manual deletion will be disabled in the event of litigation. The policy and the applications that support it should be flexible enough to issue legal holds, as well as suspend routine deletions based on custodians, data stores, date range, and all the above. And verifying and assessing each of these steps is also critical to defensibility. Preservation is aided by litigation hold, which is the process of preserving the data. There are differing methods of legal hold, and you should have defined how your organization will implement legal holds well in advance. Notification is particularly important. When litigation is imminent, it is important to identify people likely to be involved in the matter, and these people, called custodians, should be informed about their duty to preserve and be made available to answer questions about the matter. Now, another key form of being defensible is auditing. Auditing is keeping track of the discovery process when responding to a request. Now, keep in mind that any members of the discovery team may be called upon to give deposition or testimony in how data was collected, what types of policies are in place, etc. All the discovery steps from policy to production should be consistently tracked. This is especially true of the searching and collecting steps. The chain of custody detailing each, the search criteria, original data stores, hash values, and the like should be scrupulously maintained. So defensibility in all its forms is greatly aided when organizations collaborate effectively. So collaboration doesn't just mean the eDiscovery team. Even without an official eDiscovery team, in small organizations, it's kind of difficult to have a team together, but even without that team, legal, IT, and business needs should be talking to one another. Ideally, policy and process will already have been implemented before litigation is anticipated. But once it happens, with or without a team, there should be discussions which clarify a number of areas, including implementing preservation and collection policies, defining the scope of the matter, key personnel and information gathering requirements, and then initiating and managing legal hold notifications and acknowledgements. Communication between the team members, especially IT and legal, is critical to keep the collection running smoothly. To assist in this effort, an eDiscovery liaison should be identified from the legal team to work with IT to guide the process, establish parameters, and navigate challenges. The liaison should be able to answer questions, safeguard defensibility, inform meet and confer sessions, which are legally obligated in discovery, and ensure that collections address legal and other technical concerns. And just to be clear here, legal and IT should not be afraid to talk to one another. One of the big issues that we see here with our customers is the legal team doesn't have answers to questions it needs, or the IT is running blind because they don't talk to each other enough. And that shouldn't happen in a good eDiscovery process. They should know each other and they should know what is needed. And that's where we come into defining the scope. Once the discovery request becomes a reality, you need to work closely with each other to outline the details of the case and the required input from each of the stakeholders. From the outset, the scope needs to be articulated, including identifying, prioritizing key custodians or people of interest in the matter, pinpointing pertinent ESI storage locations and knowing which ones will be problematic, choosing methodology and strategy to deploy your searches, defining the parameters of the search, including dates, keywords, file types, and clarifying the delivery format for both structured and unstructured data. If you don't have this identified ahead of time, you're going to have a very difficult time finding and collecting information, or you may do it in a manner that is not going to be helpful to your case or that request. So anyway, this step is obviously made much easier if your organization is proactive in setting out data maps and creating that eDiscovery team. Now, if the process works correctly, difficulties will be recognized either as part of the proactive steps or will become apparent as the matter proceeds. Therefore, it's important that all your challenges are identified, including establishing what's reasonably accessible as related to the proportionality of the case. If something is in hidden locations or very, very difficult to access, the attorneys might be able to negotiate those out of the necessary production. You need to identify challenging areas for effective meet and confer sessions. A meet and confer session is legally required between the different cases, and that's where they hammer out the between the opposing counsel and your counsel. They're going to hammer out the details involved with what you're collecting, the keywords you're using, that sort of thing. And if you can pre-identify the areas of challenge, your attorney will go in there with a much stronger hand. You also want to address outliers such as encrypted files or corrupt data stores. Obviously, that is not going to be easily accessible, and if they do need to be collected, you're going to have to put together a process for them. And last but not least, you need to ensure compliance that all these steps we just mentioned are being monitored and they are being performed as you would do that.
So for those of you on the call who don't have a legal background, you just received a full college semester to kind of recap what's involved in an eDiscovery process. Clearly, Marta, this is a lot for any organization to plan for. And as you know, probably better than anyone, many of our clients don't have that luxury of dedicated eDiscovery teams. In fact, many of the companies we work with delegate this task to their IT people, because they're the only ones with access to all the information locations. So do you have any tips for clients that are in that specific situation?
You know, Rick, this is a lot to take in, especially for smaller organizations or cash, if they're cash strapped. And especially in this time, there's a lot of reduction in staff and reduction in resources going on. And a lot of people are looking for easier ways to go through just standard business tasks, including eDiscovery. It is a lot to take in. However, many of the steps we just talked about can be done on a smaller scale. So let's talk a little bit about implementing in when we are resource constrained. And I think the key to saving time and money here lies in 3 areas. First, we need to try to be somewhat prepared and proactive. Even if you can't have a team together, even if you can't put together official policy, the minimum that you can, if you can outline what to do when discovery pops up, that will help you because you're not going to be scrambling for resources. Next, you want to do as much as possible in-house to avoid outside expenditures and spending money on that review platform that we mentioned. If you can do a lot of that scaling in-house, then you're going to save a lot of resources. And lastly, by automating the tools you already have or investing in tools that offer a good ROI. So let's talk a little bit about preparation. I mean, we've talked a lot about it already on a larger scale, but to reiterate, being proactive is the best way to reduce risk and avoid out of control costs or disrupting your business activity. You need to try to do what you can to prepare. For example, if your organization doesn't have the time or the resources to put together a team, at least identify the key IT and legal folk that are going to be involved and keep their contact information handy. Have a few productive discussions, if you can, to pinpoint the risk on, to both on the legal side. For example, how susceptible are you to litigation? What kind of regulations do you have? Are you going to need to do open records requests? Then the IT side also has some risk areas, like what data is inaccessible, what people aren't keeping their data, where are backups located, what are the prime areas for failure? Okay, so you can get this information out ahead of time without having a whole formal process behind it. You should also know what tools you plan to use to search and collect data from the most commonly requested data stores, emails, file shares. Okay, so if you have policy in place and you're doing that, it's going to make it a lot easier. But the one thing that's going to help you the most is having a retention policy. If you can, it will save so much time in the long run and saves a lot of that rot from being produced. In other words, that redundant, outdated, trivial information, you don't want to have to hand that over to your attorneys to review. It's just going to cost you so much money. So retention policy really helps to reduce that. So if you can implement that, your future you will be very thankful. So let's talk a little bit about using in-house resources on a budget. Using in-house resources is really important because traditional methods of eDiscovery involve collecting data from email, file shares, repository, and then handing it off wholesale to outside vendors for culling, processing, review. This can be expensive because the most expensive portion of the entire eDiscovery process is that review piece. And the more data you give over to the attorneys to review, the more expensive the case will be. So a typical eDiscovery process should be about reducing that large volume of information to a practical, relevant set of documents that can be used effectively in your litigation. And using in-house resources to perform most of these steps has many advantages to organizations of any size. They include control and predictability and efficiency and integration to your overall company strategy. But let's face it, the biggest advantage of this is insourcing is cost savings. Even implementing a few of the steps such as pre-calling can significantly reduce expenditure, and this is the step most often moved in-house. Internal resources typically have the knowledge to pinpoint the appropriate data stores, and additional savings are realized by using specialized software and native tools. A good information governance policy that we discussed earlier can help with the elimination of rot, redundant, outdated, trivial, and it will combine with additional culling for domains, topics, keywords, and you'll see a significant return on investment in a minimal time frame. So taking that large data set, applying your internal resources, both personnel and software, and minimizing the amount of data going out is a key area that you can save money. Now, as litigation and regulatory requirements increase, so do the needs for eDiscovery. Even without insourcing any steps, internal resources do tend to get involved with the collection and oversight of the process. Formally setting up an eDiscovery team, or at the very least identifying resources and putting together a litigation preparedness plan, will go a long way to reduce the stress and the scrambles associated with ad hoc measures. It will also bring much needed control and predictability to the expenditures in both time and personnel. Furthermore, when used effectively, these same insourcing methods can be tasked for other purposes to support internal investigation, governance, or compliance needs. Now, another benefit of insourcing involves utilizing the expertise already present in your organization. Technical personnel, as Rick mentioned earlier, they know where the data is located and who has access to what machines and how best to collect the data. Management is aware of business processes, and records managers are skilled at understanding the information lifecycle of key documents. Your legal team and inside counsel understand the intricacies of the case. Targeting these internal resources and having them work together to support eDiscovery is just a natural extension of their roles. It also makes potential litigation less intrusive to day-to-day workload, and the effects are more predictable as processes and policies are laid out well in advance. Now, to help lay this out, you want to know and understand what your native tools are capable of, because a big part of insourcing is to use the functionality of the tools you already own. Search functionality, for example, is available in many standard solutions and it's often included in part of your licensing. This is certainly true for email, Microsoft Exchange, both on-premise and Office 365, Google Mail, Lotus Notes. They generally have inherent capabilities which have varying degrees of user-friendliness, I admit, but that capability for searching can be used to apply retention policy or even archiving. And in many cases, this native functionality will be good enough, especially for less critical cases. But you do need to make sure you test them out in advance and verify that they meet the specific needs of your organization.
Marta, I know you hear this all the time, and so do I, right? We already own these tools. They're free, they're available for us to use. But I know that they're not always the right approach to handling all eDiscovery situations, certainly. So could you maybe point out some of the downsides of using these tools? Even though they're free and available, there may be reasons you want to look in another direction.
Sure, Rick. And in fact, we can expand that to say there's cautions for using the budget approach in general. As with any processes, it has its hazards. Mistakes during discovery can cause havoc for your case. Some of these can be mitigated, but it's important to be aware that these budget options might not work for your organization. And so here are several areas that you want to keep in mind. And the first thing is that you need to recognize the limitations of the resources in your company. So you might have a lack of bandwidth or expertise. Many of the steps in this process, they're not ideal for your organization if you don't have the expertise or bandwidth among your in-house personnel. You need to have the right number and the type of resources available to cope with the fluctuating nature of litigation demands. So for example, if you have one IT person and you're having, 100 open records requests, the IT person will not be able to handle those open records requests if they're worrying about the infrastructure of their organization, their primary task. So you either have to task someone to do specifically that, or you will need to get, consultation or some other method. So make sure you have that bandwidth, make sure you have the expertise in-house, and keep in mind while you're doing that, some of your resources are going to be being pulled in regardless, and it is important to plan for that disruption. Another area where you might be lacking is, legal matters tend to carry high risk, and to help mitigate that risk, strong oversight is needed. This in turn is helped by fine-tuning your process, testing policy, and maintaining a strong audit trail. These steps will help minimize mistakes for both the legal and the technical team. You also need to get buy-in from the necessary stakeholders. It can be challenging, no doubt, especially if it means you're already adding to a full workload. Now, to get past this reluctance of people to support an eDiscovery process, you need to focus on the benefits, not just for eDiscovery, but for streamlining company procedures. And be clear when you're talking about this that proactive investment will mitigate risk, save time and resources in the long run. So you're really going to save a lot of money. It's hard to get buy-in at the first. Sometimes it only happens when litigation is imminent. You start having these requests, and maybe you can implement the process at that time. But there's other issues that you have when you're dealing with a budget solution, and you have to be really mindful in your use of native tools. As you mentioned earlier, Rick, the benefits of using the built-in capabilities, they're unmistakable. They're free, they're already in place, and your staff generally knows how to use them. But they do have their issues. And first up, you often need multiple tools. The functionality included in your native tools tends to focus just on that individual application. You cannot, for example, search your file shares from Microsoft Exchange, nor can you search inside legacy PSTs, NSF, or data from online stores like SharePoint without additional licensing, and sometimes you can't do it at all, okay, with native tools. Another thing to keep out for when you're using native tools is the modification of metadata. Without the correct tools and processes, it's surprisingly easy to change file properties. For example, if you use Windows Explorer to copy files to a new location, you can change the creation and access dates. Opening documents with native applications also can change that last access dates, and with some programs may affect modified properties. Now, Outlook is often used to search or review, but it's actually a terrible option due to lack of auditing, inconsistent results, and indexing issues, not to mention both your access date and your modified date will be changed. So there are free tools like Robocopy that can help minimize and mitigate the alterations that will be done, but you need to document it very well as part of your process. Another issue with using native tools is that customization is limited. You can't really leverage native tools if you have a very specific use case. They're difficult, if not impossible, to customize, and if the features you're seeking are not available out of the box, often you're out of luck. And this is especially true with the bigger solutions that are not as willing to modify things based on just a few cases from customers. And that leads me to another issue. The inherent limitations in the product often depend on the deployment or licensing. So for example, you may not be able to search all the keywords or perform all the reporting that you may need for your specific use case. Not to pick on Microsoft, but Office 365 and a standard licensing is limited to 20 keywords per search. The other area to be aware of is what is the back end of the system? What is the native system using to collect or search or retain data? Is it catching everything? Can it adapt to whatever your policy might be? What options are available? You need to understand this ahead of time, and you can mitigate some of these issues by educating yourself on whether or not the native tools will adapt to your specific use case. As we mentioned before, each business is different, and you want to make sure that the tools you're using are flexible enough to follow where it needs to go for your business needs. Aside from this, a big caution for taking the budget approach is faulty methodology. Now, you need to keep a sharp eye on your processes to avoid common pitfalls. Let's talk a little bit about these common pitfalls, and they include failing to audit properly. As mentioned earlier, defensibility is one of the main considerations in eDiscovery collections. But how do you know which terms were used, on which custodians, over what date range? Documentation is so important because these missing details, incomplete inventories, or lost logs can weaken a case and make it very difficult for you to testify or defend your process. Additionally, care is needed in using native applications that don't have inherent tracking. If you need to go back and rerun your searches, you want to ensure that you can repeat the process with consistent results. This is called repeatability, and it's really important in your discovery process. Now, another pitfall that we see is using custodian self-collection. A common but highly unreliable method of collection is to have custodians collect their own data. If you're doing this, you need to be very careful because this is often a recipe for disaster because it doesn't have an audit trail, has inconsistent searching, and has a potential conflict of interest. Trained impartial personnel, like your IT people, should be the ones to perform collections, preferably with native tools designed for the purpose, in other words, Office 365, for example, or using peer-reviewed, commercially available software. This helps avoid mistakes due to lack of knowledge, scope, or process. And Rick, don't forget, when in doubt, ask for assistance.
Indeed, Marta, indeed. So you have done such a great job of giving us a background in eDiscovery. I'd like to talk for a couple of minutes about some of Sherpa's approach to these eDiscovery projects and how we might in fact be able to help you with some of the pitfalls that Marta has outlined. You know, at Sherpa, we're big believers in selecting the right tool for the job, and we recognize our customers have different needs depending upon the size of the organization, especially the amount of litigation you get involved with, and perhaps the skill level of your team. So to that end, we offer 3 different products for eDiscovery: Altitude, and then 2 flavors of our Discovery Attender tool. Both Altitude and Discovery Attender are intended to help fulfill your search, review, and collection needs during the eDiscovery process. And if you remember, at a few points during Marta's discussion of the eDiscovery process, she mentioned that that review step is the most expensive part of the process. So anything you can do to streamline review, make it more effective, and reduce the amount of content is going to translate into savings at the bottom line for you. So to better understand which tool might be right for your particular organization, let's take a closer look at their capabilities. We've designed Altitude from the ground up with a couple of goals in mind. First, we wanted to provide a single platform that could be used to manage a wide variety of information. And secondly, we wanted to make sure that tool was collaborative, so it could address the needs of several constituents within your organizations. From an eDiscovery point of view, your team can manage custodian hold notices. You may recall that Marta mentioned advising your custodians that they had a duty to preserve was an important part of your process. Custodian hold notifications allow you to do that, track it, and be able to demonstrate to a judge that that notification took place. In addition to that, Altitude lets you build searches and then perform that important review step to single out responsive results and figure out which items actually respond to what the lawyers are asking for in terms of eDiscovery information. All of that information is available for your eDiscovery team from a secure, web accessible dashboard. So Altitude is partially software as a service solution. Altitude software agents then get installed within your network. Those agents connect directly to your information in place where it resides. So we're not moving it out, taking the risk of changing some of those parameters that Marta mentioned, the metadata about a piece of content, and storing it maybe in a cloud repository that is less secure, things like that. Because Altitude is web-based, many members of your team can use it simultaneously, and that might be for either discovery projects or some of the other features that Altitude provides for data governance or perhaps classification. And those can help you actually control information through its life cycle so that when your next eDiscovery comes up, there's less content that you may have to review. If you have the need to search files or email that reside on employee workstations, their laptops, for example, Altitude's an ideal solution because it has local agents that can be pushed silently to those workstations and give your discovery team visibility to the information that's being stored on the hard drives inside each of those machines. So let's take a closer look for a second at the Altitude dashboard. You can see up at the top of the Altitude dashboard here, the functional modules outlined in yellow, and those include data governance and classification, which can be added to any Altitude subscription. They provide a perfect complement to your eDiscovery. We're not going to focus on those today. We've done a couple of other webinars about our governance and classification capabilities. We're going to confine most of our attention to eDiscovery, certainly. In the center of the page, the red box highlights the various content areas Altitude can search. So you can see at a glance, Altitude allows you to reach into several information repositories to apply your search criteria. And those might be your mailboxes, your Google environment, OneDrive, SharePoint, and a number of others that sometimes can be challenging to reach. That list inside the red box is being expanded as new releases of Altitude are available. For example, our development team's currently working on any support for the Box cloud storage platform. So that should be out in a month or so, and you'll be able to access your Box content as part of your eDiscovery search or your other Altitude functionality. Within Altitude's eDiscovery module, you can create different matters. Those help you organize your search projects and link custodians so you can inform and track those custodians through the process. Once that matter is established, a simple wizard will lead you through supplying all of the details necessary to perform the search. Whose content do we want to search? What areas do we want to search into? Are there criteria like date ranges? What are your keywords, your phrases, and so forth? As those searches complete, the details of the search are uploaded into the Altitude cloud, and you can access them at that point from a reviewing pane. This is a little screenshot of what that pane looks like. And in the pane, you can examine the details about each item that matched your search criteria. You can even preview the content of the document or message by clicking that little pink icon you see in the second column. That'll show you what actually the message contained, or perhaps the MS Office document. Based on the review of the items then that you see in the list here, you can select them and apply labels that help you track your eDiscovery process. You'll see those little blue sticky notes that are attached to the top two items in the results view. Those are examples of altitude labels. Those typically track to whatever your collection process is. So they might signify this is a responsive item, or perhaps it's an item that's going to need redaction, something along those lines. So you can apply the labels as appropriate to all of the items in your search review here. And then those items will power a collection process where a forensically sound copy of the items are made and placed into a search folder, or a folder rather, in your network someplace secure. So Marta mentioned earlier that often robocopy can be used, and in fact that's what Altitude uses to make a forensically sound copy of the items you select, so that we're not modifying dates and things like that. The second tool that we'd like to talk about today is our Discovery Attender for Windows tool, and that's really Marta's champion product. So I'm going to let her talk a little bit about how that can be used to streamline your eDiscovery process.
Thanks, Rick. Now, unlike its enterprise collaborative cousin Altitude, Discovery Attender is designed with a very narrow focus that enables the in-house talent to identify and gather responsive information in a timely, defensible manner. It has a unique behind-the-firewall architecture that runs as a standalone application. It's typically up and running in minutes, and with all the processing performed on the machine where Discovery Attender resides. This product is generally used by customers who need a tool to automate their process but prefer a smaller footprint. So typical use cases include producing data for eDiscovery, cybersecurity, open records requests, compliance, and internal investigations. Now, small footprint it might have, but Discovery Attender is quite mighty. It focuses on data stores typically found in a Windows environment, from Office 365 to on-prem Exchange, documents on file shares, loose PSTs, MSGs, etc. It even searches NSF mail stores and mBoxes natively. With Discovery Attender, projects are stored locally, and there are no limits to the amount of data that you can store. Creating and managing searches is pretty easy. There's an intuitive search wizard that can customize criteria for keywords, for dates, for attachments. And once the search is finished, Discovery Attender's result screens are used to organize, export, and track your data with previewing and auditing features. Advanced actions such as deduplications, comparing searches, matching results, they're all available to supplement both the high-level and individual result reporting. In addition to these features, notes, labels, and marks can be used to help customers filter their data sets to things that are responsive, that are relevant, and it helps keep track of excluded items. These features propagate even through deduplication, which is just a simple database exercise that creates a list of unique items based on user-selected criteria. Discovery Attender uses a variety of views to capitalize on the metadata collection and to help customers delve into the details of their data while providing further filtering options by domains, addresses, file extensions, keywords. Users also have the option to apply advanced filters on properties, dates, and addresses, as well as an optional index of result terms. Once the user has tweaked the result set to their satisfaction, Discovery Attender provides numerous export options in native format. Reporting is another strength of Discovery Attender. The product features inventories of results, audit trails, and statistics based on keywords, addresses, domains, and others. All actions from search, organizations, and exporting are tracked inside the application. This information is easily accessible through the interface or by custom queries. Discovery Attender also includes a standalone utility called the Pre-Search tool, which provides additional functionality for converting to and from a variety of popular email formats, as well as snapshots, which provide an overview of data contained in email stores. And in addition to Altitude and Discovery Attender, Sherpa also has products that manage the IBM sphere. Rick, do you want to talk a little bit about those products?
Yeah, absolutely, Marta. Thank you. So rounding out our offerings today, I'd like to mention our Discovery Attender product for the Notes environment. Now, I know it's rare to find an organization using Notes as their primary email system today. I can almost hear a few chuckles in the audience. But that said, a surprising number of customers still have legacy NSF content that needs to be managed and searched for litigation purposes. For those of you who are hardcore Microsoft Exchange people, NSF is, of course, the database storage format that Lotus Notes, or today just Notes, uses. And that's where largely most of the email content is contained. And in fact, other business information in addition to that. So perhaps more importantly than being able to search that email content, Notes gives you a way to get into information that your other business applications may be storing that has to be part of your eDiscovery process. And Notes does a really good job of searching those databases as well. As you can see, the user interface for the Notes product is really a traditional Notes form. Now, while I agree this isn't very flashy, this paradigm is really familiar to any Notes administrator, typically the people who would be using this tool, and it makes it very easy for them to learn to use and in fact to perform their eDiscovery search. So like our other offerings, Discovery Tender Notes can search and collect information based on a variety of criteria. One of the really nice perks, one of the things I like about this tool is it makes it easy to redact information, which is really challenging in the Microsoft world. So if there's a portion of an email that you want to blackline so that it's not turned over for eDiscovery, you can do that natively within this tool. And that's not an easy thing to find in the eDiscovery environment. So let's talk for just a moment about how some of our customers use these tools. We're not going to go into extensive detail here, but we wanted to give you for each one of the products a high-level use case to maybe help you understand why a customer would select that particular product. And I'm going to begin with Altitude in that context. So we've talked about this a couple of times already, but the fact that a team can collaborate using Altitude has been a really popular feature of the product, right? So in many cases, the people who actually know how to access and manage and have permissions to get to the content sources are not the people who should be performing the searches or know exactly how to implement those searches. So that's where the collaboration comes into play. And in this particular customer, that was exactly the situation, right? Their IT people were performing the search or the eDiscovery searches largely, and that was becoming sort of a real diversion to their main mission, which was to keep the organization up and running from a operational point of view with the IT infrastructure. So they deployed Altitude. They moved over actually from a different solution to the Altitude product because it allowed them to delegate that responsibility. So in their scenario, this worked out perfectly. IT was able to configure all of the access to the various information stores. Those involved file shares on the network, they involved employee workstations, they involved some PST content. Once that access was configured and permissioned accordingly, then they handed the responsibility for eDiscovery searches over to their paralegals. Those folks knew nothing about how to access a network file share or what permissions were required or how to make a connection to a mailbox, but they didn't need to. That was all done for them. They could focus on their main task, which was providing all of the search criteria that the legal counsel told them they needed to implement as part of their search process, being able to actuate that and get a search results list back, review that content, and then collect it for their outside counsel to be able to move forward with. So that's a really good situation for a client to use Altitude, maybe a reason that you might want to look at Altitude as an answer.
Well, let me talk a little bit about, since Rick was talking about a case in Altitude, let me give you an example for Discovery Tender for Windows. Discovery Tender for Windows is uniquely suited to have a good return on investment, and we have a number of case studies that highlight this. A very typical example is an overwhelmed IT department on a tight budget, which is pummeled by requests. In smaller organizations especially, the IT team is tasked with producing results, but it can be challenging for them if they're not using the right tools, or more distressingly, if they're using manual ones. In the example noted here, this was a city department that was dealing with open records requests in addition to the eDiscovery for legal team. As an aside, they're not the only ones. Many government entities and schools that are customers of ours have seen a huge increase in open records requests in recent years, and this volume has become debilitating without having the right tools in place. In any case, in this particular case study, the IT department was able to gain a 75% improvement in turnaround time just by automating their process. Being able to track what they've done and getting consistent results, well, that was just icing on the cake. And I'm always happy to hear when someone says that the product paid for itself in the first case as was the case here. So Rick, as you know, we find this response repeated with Notes customers as well. Notes is a tricky beast. You know, as you've mentioned, there are some very large companies who use legacy application databases, even if they have migrated away from Notes mail. Now, this data not only needs to be managed, but it's also discoverable. And as Rick mentioned earlier, we have tools for both management and e-discovery in the Notes world. In this particular case study, it was Discovery Tender for Notes, and it was used to collect responsive information for litigation. This customer had a very large amount of data, over 5,000 databases that were mixed. In other words, they were both email and application databases, and the legal department was battering that poor, overburdened IT department with requests, and they were struggling to meet the deadlines. Without the right tools, it was taking them forever, and they really weren't able to give the legal department everything they needed. So the Notes administrator did a Google search, found Sherpa, and it was a match made in heaven. Not only was the immediate project completed with Dispatch, and let us not forget Defensibly, but Discovery Tender for Notes was also intuitive that the legal department was able to take over the searching. And that, Rick, was a win-win for everybody.
And that's what we like to hear. Marta, I've really enjoyed this tag team approach. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with everybody today. It was great. And thank you all for attending the webinar. I hope we provided you with some new insights about how to implement or maybe tune or fine-tune your e-discovery process on a budget. And if any of our audience members have questions, Marta, I'll be happy to try and address them at this point.